Welcome back to the session. We are continuing with the discussions on Karl Marx, his theories on history, his theories on economics, on social change, and a host of very fascinating ideas. So hope you remember that yesterday we discussed one of his central arguments, or one of his foundational arguments of his whole theory, known as dialectical materialism or historical materialism, a theory that he develops in order to explain the evolution of humankind or to explain social change, or a theoretical foundation that that he developed in order to understand the basic functioning of a society, in order to provide an explanation about the social structure of every society, and an explanatory paradigm to explain how societies move from one state to the other one. And we discussed about the way in which he conceived of society comprising of a base and a superstructure. We discussed about the base and superstructure. We discussed about how the economy or the forms of economic production constitutes the base, and how that has a overarching influence on various elements that are grouped under the term superstructure, which includes almost everything else other than the economic sphere. We discussed about mode of production. We discussed about its different components. So today in this class we are focusing more on his theory of social change. How did Marx conceive of social change? Or in other words, what is a kind of a Marxian explanation for social change? How did Marx put forward a very powerful, extremely influential argument about social change? And we know that ever since these Marxian arguments about social change, they have been taken up by scores of social scientists, theoreticians, and then scholars, and there have been relentless discussions and debates, endless discussions and debates about Marxian notion of social change. Many people agreed with that, many people disagreed with that, but it still continued to be one of the very important explanatory paradigm to understand how societies move from one stage to the another. Now, just as an economic conception of society, he advances an economic interpretation of history. As we discussed yesterday, Marx basically understands society as something which is being driven by its economic features. So similarly, he advances an economic interpretation of history, as history being moving forward by the economic forces. For Marx, the history of humanity is not a story of great men or great ideas or spectacular political events or the unfolding of human consciousness. Instead, he declares the true focus and theatre of all history is economic life. And this is a very major departure from many of the conventional understanding or conventional explanations about social change. We know that when we study history, we study it through some contributions of some important figures like kings and emperors, or we discuss social change through various different frameworks. But Marx is very particular. Marx is very clear that a human history must be understood through the lens of its material production, or how a society moves from one stage to the another, or how a society evolves needs to be captured. It needs to be understood by looking at the changes that is happening in the realm of its material production. So it is not it's not a story of great men, it's not a story of great ideas transforming societies all on a sudden, or it is not even spectacular political events, because Marx argued that these political events are a consequences of much more deeper economic changes, or the unfolding of human consciousness as argued by, say, idealists like Hegel and others. So instead he declares that the true focus and theatre of all history is the economic, like a very powerful, of course contentious and debatable, but a very powerful argument. The history of all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle. Another very extremely popular quote from Karl Marx. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So it's an extremely popular, very popular quote. So he argues that it is a class struggle is the history of every hitherto existing society, without looking into these forms of class struggle, how people are classified into different classes, different groups, and what is the kind of an antagonistic relationship between them, and what is the kind of an economic rationale behind this antagonism. Without looking into these dynamics, one will not understand the true history of any society as per Karl Marx. So, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a world, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. All these quotes are taken from his very popular, extremely popular work, the Communist Manifesto, co-authored with Frederick Engels. So he understands society as the antagonism between primarily two groups of people who own the means of production and who do not own, and all these categories that he has given, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, or bourgeoisie and proletariat, all these represent these two antagonistic groups in different periods in history. So he talks about, he's presenting a larger picture about social change. How does his explanation of social change unfold? Let us see. First, there is, according to Marx, a strong historical tendency driven by the requirement of human survival along with the advances in science and technology for the forces of production to develop, to increase in power over time. He's talking about how our production technologies and efficiency of production and overall quality of production for meeting our material needs improved over a period in time. And we know that we have developed tremendously over the past so many centuries in terms of meeting our basic needs, in developing new novel needs, and then our ability to satisfy these needs. So with the help of science and technology and a host of other aspects, human beings have the ability to continuously expand their realm of production to meet the existing needs as well as to identify and also to fulfill the new forms of needs. This fact, the continuous accumulation of productive forces, endows human history with a certain coherence or meaningfulness and paves way for progress. So it is very clear from this argument that Marx understands human progress not in terms of the progress in terms of the emergence of new ideas. Marx understands human progress specifically as the progress in terms of expanding new forms of production. We are human beings as a race is able to expand their forms of production, inventing new forms of production, expanding the various processes of production. In contrast to philosophers of the French Enlightenment, for whom progress meant the liberation of humanity from false ideas, a passage from ignorance to wisdom, for Marx, progress takes the form of increasing economic productivity and the evolution of modes of production. It's very, very clear, because he did not subscribe to the idealist argument which looked at human progress as a progress from one type of ideas to the another. Given the fact that Marx was a materialist, he argued that the human progress needs to be understood as a march towards or as a progress through the development of new material forms and economic productivity and evolution of new modes of production. Secondly, as the introduction of new methods of production transforms the labor process and increase productivity, the social relations of production are likewise altered. So here he is bringing in the tension between the technical and material aspects of production on the one hand and the relations which are involved in the process of production on the other. Advances in technology cause shifts in class structure and in the larger social framework of society. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production. And in changing their mode of production, in changing the way of earning their life, they change all their social relations. So when new forms of production, new forces of production come into picture, when people move from an agrarian society where agriculture is the mainstay of economy, into a capitalist society where factory and tools and machinery are the most important forms of production, Marx argues that the relationship between the classes of people who are involved in the process of production also change, because these changes are not confined. These changes do not confine themselves within the realm of forces of production, but they have the ability to spill over, or they have the ability to influence the social relationship. So this is an extremely important point, and this is also the crux through which Marx explains why social change, or how social change takes place, and how revolution takes place, how society moves from one stage to the next one. So when a society moves from a slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to communism, as according to Marxian argument, all these changes are propelled by technological changes, all these changes are propelled by changes in the forces of production, but the implications of these changes also specifically, definitely influence the social relations. The hand mill gives you society with feudal load, the steam mill society with industrial capitalist, because the people who own the means of production, the people who take away the surplus value, the people who live off the surplus that is produced by others, their designation changes, their characteristics changes, their relationship with the people who actually involved in the process of production also changes. Third, as society's productive forces develop, Marx argues they eventually come into conflict with the existing relations of production, which fetter or inhibit the continued growth and full utilization of society's productive capacity. So he says that these advancements in the forces of production, technological changes, of course we know that these technological innovations are much faster in pace, they are much faster than social relationship. So these technological changes will become much faster in its pace, it will advance much faster, and that ultimately will become an impediment. Marx uses the term a fetter, a chain, or it inhibits the continued growth and full utilization of society's productive capacity. So, for example, when he explains the development of capitalism in Europe, Marx argues that the development of technological innovations like steam engine and a host of other technological innovations during the 16th and 17th century, or even after that. So these changes were it happened at a much faster pace, and these changes kind of necessitated that the existing feudal system can no longer be a viable mode of production. So it actually forced the society to move into a newer form where the labor supply is free, the laborer is free in a sense which he will explain down the line. So the social existing social relations after some time will become as a fetter, it becomes an obstacle, it becomes an impediment for the further growth of this technological advancements and the further movement of society, of this forces of this mode of production to the next level. At a certain point, the relations of production are unable to accommodate the potential built up by the forces of production, and these circumstances create a pressure for the fundamental change in the economic structure of society. So this particular point captures his explanation about this point of crisis in a given mode of production, which is composed of both relations of production as well as forces of production. The forces of production advance more rapidly, and at the same time these relations of production remains almost static, and then comes a flashpoint where the relations of production becomes a fetter, and it can no longer advance, or it no longer can improve, and thereby bringing a much rapid or much comprehensive change, so that the whole structure of that mode of production moves, it collapses, it moves into a qualitatively different realm where the relations of productions are completely redefined. Or in other words, for example, the relation of production characteristic of a feudal society becomes an impediment for the further growth of technological advancements and efficiency brought in by technological advancements during a feudal era, and that reaches a flashpoint, and the entire form of production, entire mode of production moves to the next level of that of capitalism, where the forces of production are, of course, facilitated by further technological advancements, but the relations of production are also at a completely different qualitative level. In a capitalist society, the relationship between the bourgeoisie and proletariat are completely different from the relationship between a serf and his lord, and they were completely different from the relationship between a master and a slave. Fourth, once it reaches a crisis point, Marx argues, the contradiction between the forces and relations of production inaugurates an era of social revolution. So this flashpoint Marx explains as the point of social revolution. This is eventually resolved by the destruction of the old economic structure along with its whole immense superstructure. So I hope you remember what constitutes under this superstructure. Okay, Marx puts virtually almost everything else within the superstructure except the economic base. So when you say that there is a destruction of the old economic structure along with a whole immense superstructure, Marx argues that almost everything else other than the economy, which includes your law, your literature, your notions of morality, your social organization, your political system, your character of your state, character of your political system, almost everything, this whole immense superstructure, and is replaced, and it is replacement by a new mode of production suitable for the continued growth of forces of production. So he understands a social change as something that is propelled by a continuous change or continuous improvement or continuous advancements in the forces of production. So the superstructure gets replaced, superstructure gets dislodged because the base gets completely reformulated. Human history, propelled by the accumulation of productive forces, is thus for Marx a story of how one mode of production develops, matures, stagnates, and eventually gives way to another, more advanced mode of production. So that is why, along with a number of other scholars of modernity in Europe, he also conceives of social changes as something that is taking place through different distinct stages. If we remember, when we discussed Auguste Comte, he talks about three stages: theological, metaphysical, and positive. And when we discuss Durkheim, we will come across similar kind of characterization. So here as well, Marx also is somebody who belongs to that category, who understood social change as taking place through definitive periods, definitive modes in a kind of an evolutionary manner. And this is something quite common or very important characteristic feature of most of the social scientists and thinkers of Europe during that particular time. And needless to say, they all understood Europe as representing that particular model, and argued that almost all other societies, every other society needs to do this catching up business with Europe. So they are talking about one mode of production, it developing, it matures, and then it stagnates because the relations of productions is not able to catch up with the changes, with the pace of change taking place in the mode of production, and then eventually that leads to a crisis, a revolution, which takes this entire thing into a qualitatively different realm, which again has this kind of an inherent contradiction. So here you will see how Marx very beautifully employs the method of dialectics, the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And the synthesis again contains the contradictory qualities of opposite tendencies, which again leads to a kind of a higher, it leads to a kind of a higher form. His formulation of major modes of production: slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and post-capitalism or communism, and Asiatic mode of production. And this is again a very controversial and contentious category about how many specific modes of production did Marx formulate. for example, he talks about slavery, he talks about feudalism, capitalism, and post-capitalism. He doesn't really call it as communism. He doesn't really develop it further. And he also has a completely different one as an Asiatic mode of production, which really does not fit into this universal categories. So there are quite a lot of interesting discussions and debates about Marxian ideas about this types of modes of production. Because as we discussed the other day, Marx presents a meta theory, okay? A theory which is so broad in its scope that he's trying to give a theory about the whole social change that the human kind has witnessed so far. So in order to give a very comprehensive theory of that sort, he's providing a kind of a universal explanation. An explanation which must be applicable to the whole world, to every society, to every culture, to every human civilization, and that is not an easy task. So that is why this the whole lot of debates and discussions about Asiatic mode of production, about how many specific modes of production that Marx propounded, and the argument whether Marx understood this Asiatic mode of production completely, because we are not going into that, but there are a lot of argument that the Marx did not understand the kind of economic character of Asian societies, the kind of material that he received to formulate this Asiatic mode of production as a unique mode of production were very limited. They were biased, they were erroneous, and a lot of criticism in that direction. So this dialectical process inherent in the economic base of each of these modes create crisis revolution and creates a qualitatively better form, which again contains the inherent contradictions. This movement of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis towards a structurally more complicated mode of production will come to an end with the post-capitalist era, where the classes will be obliterated and the state will wither away. This is another prophecy. This is another prediction that Marx put forward. We all know that this did not come true. And this was a prediction, this was a hope, or this was a kind of a inspiration for a whole lot of political activists who were involved with Marxism and communism, that they all believed that the capitalism will destroy itself, because as per this Marxian argument, capitalism also has seeds of its own destruction. It should lead to a kind of a revolution, and Marx argued that it will lead to a post-capitalist era, whether you call it as a communism or not, and whether the classes will be obliterated. It will be a classless society, and the state will wither away. And he even argued that it will be characterized by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Extremely problematic, extremely controversial and contentious arguments. Okay, what does it mean to be a stateless society? Are we anywhere close to that kind of a situation? What is there to replace the state? And what does it mean to be a classless society? And you know that at least now we realize that these ideas remain only as wishful thinking. These ideas remain only as a kind of imaginations, okay, has not come into reality in anywhere. Even in some of the communist societies, the so-called communist societies, whether it is the USSR or Russia or China, these things have not happened. Classes have not withered away, the state have not been obliterated. They all centered around extremely powerful, extremely authoritative states. So one of the most weakest points of Marxian theory is his prediction about social revolution and an era of communism and the emergence of a classless society and a situation where people live without being ruled by a state. So he defined classes. We have come to this point earlier. He defines classes on the basis of ownership of means of production. So unlike many of the other definitions of class, which bases on the basis of your economic position, the money that you own, Marxian definition of class is rather simple. It is defined on the basis of the ownership of means of production. The people who own the means of production and the people who do not own. For example, in a factory, the workers do not own the means of production because they do not own the factory, they do not own the raw materials, they do not own the machinery, and on the other hand, the factory owner owns the means of production. So it's between these two men, the haves and the have-nots, and masters and slaves, feudal lords and serfs, bourgeoisie and proletariat. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle, as we discussed. And so he wants to understand the social change as something that is unfolding through the conflict between these two classes. And he talks about this, a couple of explanations about this class struggle as the kind of dynamics of this particular revolution. He defines this movement from say slavery to feudalism, feudalism to capitalism, and then from capitalism to communism. All these things happen through this class struggle. So let us spend a couple of minutes trying to understand how does Marx explain this class struggle. So he argues that this class struggle will be preceded by something what he calls it as a class polarization. In a society, the class interest, people will become extremely conscious about their class position, and the society will get polarized into two mutually antagonistic group, the one who own the means of production, the others who do not own the means of production. So as per his account, in a capitalist society, all the workers will they will assume their class consciousness. So here there is a very important term that he uses. He says that from a class in itself, people will move towards class for itself, then when the workers realize their historical role. So this is an extremely important point, because it talks about how the consciousness of workers play an extremely important role in the creation of history. So Marx would argue that a worker, while working in an extremely exploitative situation, will realize that he is a part of a larger working class population, and he has a historical role to play, and this historical role is to overthrow this existing situation, because so that is the time when he realizes that the system of exploitation that he is experiencing is not something unique to him. Okay, everybody of his class, every other proletariat, every other worker is subjected to similar forms of exploitation. So he has a historic role to oppose that. He has a historic role to overthrow this particular system. So that is why he says that from a class in itself is a situation where the people are not aware of the class consciousness. And in a class for itself, it's a situation where the members are aware of their class consciousness. They become aware of their important role as a member of a role, of member of a class, and they are aware that they have to, or they are supposed to take part in a historical process of overthrowing this particular system. And so here it's an extremely important point where Marx is bringing in elements of changes in consciousness, different understanding of subjective position, how different forms of consciousness can inspire people to take up different forms of political activism, and that leads to what he calls it as a revolution, a complete comprehensive change of society, which propels the society into a completely different higher realm. And he ends this Communist Manifesto with this extremely popular quote, which has inspired millions and millions of people across the globe. The proletariats have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Working men of all countries unite. And this was a call for all the working class people, and as I told you, a quote that really inspired millions of people for generations together. So we are winding up the session today, and we'll meet you in the next class with a discussion on capitalism. Thank you.